I remember the way old paper smells, like dust and wood smoke, with a whisper of something permanent. You ever hold a document so old, the ink looks like it could float off the page? That is what I felt the first time I saw a replica of the Constitution. It was not just a sheet of rules. It was a country becoming a thought, a promise still deciding what kind of promise it wanted to be. America back then was not yet a shape, not yet a voice. It was questions with no answers. What is freedom? Who gets to have it? And what happens when 13 loud neighbors try to build one quiet home? That home. It started with arguments, with fear, with a blank page waiting for something bold, something careful, something new. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it is whispered by those who stayed up late, pen in hand, staring at a flickering candle, hoping the words they chose would outlive them. And tonight, I want to take you through that page, word by word, by line, as if you were there when the ink was still wet. The morning after freedom. The war had ended, but the war did not leave. It lingered in the smell of burned fields and the clatter of wooden crutches on dirt roads. Soldiers went home to nothing, no pensions, no land, no certainty. Some had fought for liberty and now begged for bread. Others still clung to their muskets not out of duty, but because it was the only thing that had not been taken from them. And then there was the government, if you could even call it that. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was less of a nation and more of a handshake. 13 states each with their own laws, currencies, and rivalries, stitched together by little more than good intentions and mutual exhaustion. Congress had no power to tax, no executive branch, no national court. It could raise an army but could not feed it. It could make treaties but could not enforce them. It was, as one man said, like trying to steer a ship with no captain and no rudder. Still, people tried to believe. They called it liberty. They called it independence. And for a while that was enough. There were parades, fireworks, church bells that rang for hours. George Washington had gone back to Mount Vernon, refusing to become king. That gesture alone felt like proof that America was destined for something noble. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Merchants in New York refused to accept paper money from Rhode Island. Virginia and Maryland bickered over the Potomac. Farmers in western Massachusetts whispered about marching east with pitchforks and grievances. Britain, having lost the war, now waited patiently to win the peace-flooding American markets with cheap goods, testing boundaries along the frontier and watching to see if this so-called republic would implode from the inside. People were free, yes, but they were also hungry, angry, and uncertain about who was in charge, or if anyone really was. It was during this uneasy calm that the idea of America began to feel less like a celebration and more like a question. What exactly had they won? A war, yes, but a nation. There were taverns full of veterans who grumbled about broken promises. There were cities where debtors' prisons overflowed. Even the word united started to sound ironic. The states had declared independence not just from Britain, but from each other. Still, the dream flickered. In Philadelphia, in Boston, in Richmond, people met in dimly lit rooms and argued late into the night. They debated trade policies, frontier defense, how to settle debts. But always underneath it all, they asked the same thing: can freedom survive its own chaos? There were no easy answers. Some called for a stronger central government. Others warned that any such power would become a new tyranny. They had just escaped a crown. Were they now to build a scepter? And yet, something had to give. You could feel it in the way newspapers wrote about rising unrest, in the letters exchanged between worried men, in the sermons that spoke not of salvation, but of civics. Even the weather seemed uncertain, harsh winters, dry summer's crops that withered or drowned with equal unpredictability. It was a nation in search of its own reflection, and in the middle of it all, there were those who began to write. Not just letters, but plans. Not just complaints, but frameworks. Quietly, carefully, they began to sketch out what a real union might look like. They knew it would not be perfect. They knew it would be fought over, torn, and revised. But they believed that words, if chosen carefully enough, could hold a country together. Even one made of quarrelsome states, fractured loyalties, and fresh scars. No one was certain, not really. But in the smoky taverns and candlelit parlors of that fragile young country, you could hear the first whispers of something different. Not just liberty from a king, but liberty within a system. Not just freedom to be alone, but freedom to belong. And that was the beginning of a constitution. Not yet written, but already needed. Some nights you could walk through the streets of Boston or Philadelphia and hear the quiet sound of frustration, building like a kettle, just starting to whistle. Storefronts were boarded up, not because of storms, but because of debts unpaid. Currency from one state was refused in another, leading to fistfights in marketplaces. A man might work all season to harvest his fields, only to find that his paper money would not buy a single barrel of flour. And still, there was no one to appeal to. No judge who could overrule, no national bank to stabilize the chaos. Just more talk, more promises, more silence. It was not that the people had lost faith in the dream. It was that the dream had become too vague to touch. In New England, farmers began to meet at night, not to conspire, but to commiserate. They shared stories of losing their land to taxes they could not afford, of being jailed for debts they had no means to repay. These were not rebels, not criminals, just men who had marched against the British and now stood abandoned by the country they helped free. I read once in a letter from a Massachusetts shopkeeper that he saw more fear in his neighbor's eyes in 1786 than he ever did during the war. And it was not fear of redcoats or invasions. It was fear of losing everything to court's creditors and confusion. The Articles of Confederation had given the states a long leash, but now many wondered whether the dog had run too far, dragging the nation behind it. Foreign governments watched with amusement and caution. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade, and the federal Congress could do little more than write a stern letter. Britain, still holding forts along the Great Lakes, ignored treaties as if America were an unruly child, not worth correcting. Without the power to tax or to raise a proper army, the government could only watch and wait. In that silence, whispers grew. You could hear it in taverns, in churches, even in schoolhouses. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. There were those who feared any change at all, who clung to the Articles not out of confidence, but out of memory. They had bled for independence, and the idea of creating a stronger federal government felt like betrayal. After all, had they not just escaped a monarchy, why build another? But there were others, men like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who saw not betrayal, but opportunity. A chance to build a framework that would preserve liberty, not by accident, but by design. They spoke of balance, of structure, of a republic guided by principle, yet flexible enough to endure time's weather. Still, the air was heavy with uncertainty. It was the kind of uncertainty you feel before a storm, not violent, yet, but undeniable. A pause in the wind, a hush in the trees, the kind that makes you look to the sky and wonder, how much longer? No one knew it yet, but the storm was already on the horizon, and it was coming from within. When the farmers marched on their own government, it began as many things do with letters. They were not loud or dramatic, just quiet pieces of paper passed between men who had fought side by side. Men who had left their farms to bleed for independence, and now returned to find those same farms sold at auction. The ink was faded, but the message was sharp. Something is wrong, and we will not be silent. In western Massachusetts, the soil was thin, and the winters were cruel. But the people were proud. They had no interest in politics, really. Most of them could not even vote, despite having risked their lives in war. But they knew injustice when it came knocking, and it came often in the form of tax collectors' court summons and debt notices nailed to doors like warnings. Daniel Shays was not a man who sought trouble. He had been a captain in the Continental Army, respected by his peers, known for keeping calm under fire. But now, like so many others, he owed more money than he could pay. Not because he had lived beyond his means, but because the new government had no way to support its own veterans. His war pay had been delayed, reduced, or paid in nearly worthless currency. And the creditors were not interested in excuses. You could feel it brewing. The courts in Springfield and Northampton became battlegrounds, though not in the way anyone expected. Men would gather unarmed but unrelenting, and simply stand outside the courthouse doors, refusing to let them open. They carried no muskets, only grievances. They said, "We will not let you take one more farm. We will not let you imprison one more man for a debt that should never have existed." The newspapers called it a mob, but it felt more like mourning. They marched in silence, sometimes hundreds at a time. Veterans with worn boots and homemade coats, walking beside their sons, their neighbors, their pastors, not to overthrow the government, but to remind it that they were still here. The governor of Massachusetts saw it differently. To him, this was rebellion, sedition. He called up the militia, but many militiamen refused to fight their own townspeople. So instead, he turned to wealthy merchants in Boston, who funded a private army. That fact alone said something the state could not afford, to defend itself not without the pockets of the powerful. And so, it came to blood. In January of 1787, in the deep of winter, Shays and his followers marched on the Federal Armory in Springfield. They did not intend violence, but they hoped to seize weapons as leverage, to force the legislature to hear them. What they got instead was gunfire, cannon fire even. 4 men died, more were wounded. The rest scattered into the hills. Shays escaped, but the rebellion was over, at least on paper. But in truth, it had only begun. Because something about that winter stayed in people's minds. It was not just the fact that veterans had taken up arms against their own state. It was the reason why. That men could give their youth to a revolution only to be crushed by the very freedom they had helped build it, made something shift in the American soul. In Philadelphia, in New York, in Charleston, leaders took notice. Even George Washington, retired and quiet at Mount Vernon, was alarmed. What stronger evidence can be given of the want of energy in our government, he wrote, than these disorders? Alexander Hamilton, ever the architect, saw Shays' rebellion not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He wrote to his allies that if they did not act now, if they did not fix the structure of the nation, then someone else would, and not with ink and reason, but with violence and force. And so behind closed doors, the whispers grew louder. What began as scattered meetings in taverns and city halls began to crystallize into a plan. A convention, a gathering not to tweak the articles, but to replace them. To write something stronger, something that could hold. But that is the next chapter. For now what mattered was, this a group of farmers cold and tired had walked into history, not as traitors, but as messengers. And though their rebellion failed, their message echoed. The Articles of Confederation, once hailed as a symbol of liberty, now looked fragile, like a rope fraying in too many places. Shays and his followers had tugged at one end and nearly pulled the whole nation apart, not with bullets, but with questions. In the months that followed, many of the rebels were captured. Most were pardoned, though a few were sentenced to death before having their sentences commuted. Daniel Shays himself disappeared into quiet exile, living out his days in near obscurity. He never sought fame. He never claimed victory. And yet his name remained spoken, not with scorn, but with something closer to respect. I remember reading a line in an old farmer's diary from that winter. It said, "We were not fighting the law. We were fighting its absence." That stayed with me. Because that was the real wound, you see. Not that they had broken the law, but that the law had never shown up when they needed it most. That their voices, once called patriotic, were now called dangerous. That after years of sacrifice, the country they loved had become a stranger at their own doorstep. The newspapers in Boston painted them as rabble, rebels, enemies of order. But in the rural towns where roofs still leaked and grain still ran short, they were simply neighbors who had run out of ways to ask nicely. And in a way, their march on the courthouse was not just a protest. It was a mirror. A mirror held up to a government that had asked for loyalty, but forgotten gratitude. That had praised the common man in war, only to tax him into silence in peace. No one wanted anarchy. No one wanted kings. What they wanted was simple fairness, representation, a system that would not tilt with every gust of money or mood, a country where they could plant their crops without wondering if the land would still be theirs come spring. That is why Shays's rebellion matters. Not because of the weapons or the shouting or the brief takeover of a courthouse, but because it asked the kind of question a young country cannot ignore. What happens when liberty forgets to look after its own? The answer, as it turned out, would come soon, in a hot room in Philadelphia, with closed windows and pens scratching paper that would try impossibly to hold a republic together. The Summer of Arguments. Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was not kind. The air hung heavy, soaked in sweat and smoke. Horses clopped along cobblestone streets where flies gathered thick around market stalls. The smell of yeast and tobacco clung to the walls. And in a long, stuffy room inside the Pennsylvania State House, 55 men gathered to do something that had never been done before. They arrived from 13 states, though not all at once. Some came late. Some never showed. Rhode Island, suspicious of strong government, refused to participate entirely. But those who came brought trunks of papers-worn coats and the weight of their own state's problems. They called it a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. But quietly, many already knew they would tear the old structure down and start from scratch. George Washington sat at the front, silent and watchful, elected unanimously to preside. His very presence was enough to calm tempers, or at least to make men think twice before raising their voices. He had returned from the war to his farm and had not wanted to leave it. But he had seen the unrest. He had read about Shays. And when he arrived in Philadelphia, people whispered that perhaps America had one last chance to hold itself together. James Madison, barely over 30, came with notebooks and a plan. He had studied ancient governments, Roman senates, Greek assemblies. He believed America needed more than a patchwork. It needed architecture, a system of checks, a balance of ambitions, a structure that could withstand both chaos and power. Others disagreed. The Virginia Plan, championed by Madison, proposed a strong national government with representation based on population. Large states liked it. Small states did not. New Jersey offered its own plan, equal representation for all states regardless of size. That felt fairer, at least to those with fewer mouths to count. Arguments rose quickly. Some men paced. Others slammed their hands on desks. One delegate walked out entirely. Another threatened to return home and publish everything discussed if he did not get his way. There were Northern merchants and Southern planters, slaveholders and abolitionists, Federalists who feared disorder, and Anti-Federalists who feared kings. They all wanted a country, but not all agreed on what kind of country it should be. And yet, they kept talking. The windows were kept closed even in the heat to keep eavesdroppers out. That made the room stifling. Delegates wiped their foreheads with handkerchiefs and unbuttoned their coats, but they stayed. Day after day. Week after week. From May until September, they argued over everything: how to elect a president, how long he should serve, whether Congress should have one chamber or two, how laws would be enforced, and perhaps most divisive of all, how to count enslaved people. The 3/5 compromise was not noble. It was not even logical. It was a bargain struck not because it made sense, but because no one could agree on anything better. For every 5 enslaved persons, 3 would be counted toward a state's population. That gave Southern states more power in Congress, without granting rights to those who were being counted. It was in many ways a mirror of the contradictions at the heart of the new nation, a country born in liberty, yet willing to cage it when convenient. Some men protested. Others held their tongues. Many knew the compromise would haunt the country later. But they convinced themselves that unity now was worth the price of trouble later. That, to preserve the Union, they had to swallow certain poisons. I remember reading one delegate's letter. He called it a union held together by pins and prayer. And still they kept writing. Every clause was a duel, every paragraph a negotiation. They invented things as they went: electoral colleges, bicameral legislatures, veto power, judicial review. Much of it had no precedent, no example, just hope, fear, and the belief that human ambition could be both unleashed and contained. At night, many stayed in the same boarding houses. They drank ale together, read the same newspapers. Some prayed, some smoked in silence. But come morning, they returned to that room to argue again. Not all voices were equal. Women were not invited. Enslaved people had no say. Native nations who still held vast lands in the West were barely mentioned. The Constitution as it began to form was a document of its time, and also one that tried in fits and starts to reach beyond it. By late August, the room was tired. Tempers dulled by repetition. The pages had grown thick with revisions, crossouts, and annotations. But slowly, a shape began to appear. Not perfect, not finished, but something that could stand. It was September when they finally signed it. Not all delegates remained. Some refused. But 39 men stepped forward and wrote their names at the bottom of a new beginning. They did so in silence. There were no cheers, no music, just ink paper and the weight of what they had done. Benjamin Franklin, now 81, and carried to the hall in a sedan chair, looked around the room and said he had long wondered whether the sun carved into the back of Washington's chair was rising or setting. Now at length he said, "I have the happiness to know that it is a rising sun." Maybe it was. Maybe it still is. After the signing, the delegates went home. Some returned to farms, others to courtrooms. A few rode home, wondering if the document they had just signed would ever be ratified. After all, it was only ink on parchment. It had no teeth. Not yet. The Constitution, as it stood then, had no guarantee of survival. It still needed to pass through the furnace of public opinion, through state legislatures full of suspicion and pride. Men who had not been in that room, who had not sweated through those long summer days, would now be asked to trust what had been created behind closed doors. Some called it brilliant, others called it a betrayal. In taverns, people argued over the lack of a Bill of Rights. In newspapers, anonymous essays began to appear, some defending the new government, others warning of tyranny. The ink had barely dried, and already the battle over its meaning had begun. But for that moment, in that quiet September morning, the city of Philadelphia exhaled. The delegates stepped out of the hall and into the open air. They blinked against the sunlight, adjusted their hats, and mounted their horses. And for the first time in months, the room behind them was still. No more arguments, no more sweat, just silence and the sound of a nation trying to take its first careful breath. The Great Compromise's ratification was not guaranteed. Signing a document in a closed room was one thing. Convincing 13 states to accept it, that was something else entirely. The ink had barely dried before the doubts began. In state assemblies from New Hampshire to Georgia, men stood and raised questions. Some read the Constitution aloud and frowned at its vagueness. Others pointed to what was not there: no guarantee of free speech, no clear limits on federal power, no mention of individual rights. And underneath it all was the fear that the very government they had just fought to escape might be returning dressed in new clothes. The country fractured again, not by muskets, but by pamphlets. Federalists who supported the new Constitution argued it was the only way to prevent chaos. Without a strong central authority, they warned the states would collapse under their own bickering. They pointed to Shays' Rebellion as proof. The Articles had failed. The Union was fraying. Something stronger was needed. Anti-Federalists saw it differently. To them, the proposed government looked suspiciously like the monarchy they had escaped. A powerful president, a national army, a judiciary not elected by the people. These were not safeguards. They were red flags. They feared a distant elite would rule from a faraway capital, ignoring the needs of farmers and laborers. In taverns and town halls, the debate took on a life of its own. Some states split down the middle. In Virginia, Patrick Henry thundered against the Constitution, while James Madison defended it with precision. In New York, the newspapers became battlegrounds. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison himself wrote dozens of essays under the pseudonym Publius, trying to win hearts with logic and layered argument. The Federalist Papers, as they came to be known, were not flashy. They were dense, legalistic, and sometimes dry, but they laid the foundation for how Americans would come to understand their government, not as a perfect machine, but as a fragile balance of ambition and restraint. Still, not every argument could be solved with words. The deeper rifts remained: North and South, slaveholding and free, urban and rural. States with large populations wanted more representation. Small states demanded equality. Some states threatened to walk away if they were not heard. Others hinted at forming their own unions if pushed too far. And so the Great Compromises began. First came the question of representation. The larger states supported the Virginia Plan, which based congressional seats on population. The smaller states feared being drowned out and demanded equal voice. The solution was the Connecticut Compromise, also called the Great Compromise. It created a bicameral legislature, a House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate where every state had 2 seats no matter its size. It was not elegant, but it was acceptable. Next came slavery. No issue cut deeper. The Southern economy was built on enslaved labor. Cotton, tobacco, rice all flowed from plantations worked by people who had no rights, no freedom, no recognition under law. The Northern delegates were not united in opposition. Many benefited from trade linked to slavery, but they knew the contradiction was growing louder. In debate after debate, the question returned, would enslaved people be counted in a state's population? The South wanted it. They needed the numbers to gain political power. The North pushed back, and so came another bitter compromise. For every 5 enslaved persons, 3 would be counted for purposes of representation and taxation. It was a calculation that reduced lives to fractions. No one was proud of it. Not really. But they told themselves it was necessary, that without it, the South would never join the Union. That unity now was more important than justice now. They left the fight for later. And later, as history would show, would be long, bloody, and far more painful than they could imagine. Then came sovereignty. Who had the final say? The states or the new federal government? Here too came compromise. The Constitution allowed states to govern themselves in most internal matters, education, trade, civil law. But it also gave sweeping powers to Congress and the President to raise armies, regulate commerce, coin money, declare war. And it established a Supreme Court to interpret these powers, though no one could fully predict how much that court would eventually shape the nation. It was, in many ways, a document built on tension. Every strength balanced by a weakness. Every liberty paired with a clause of control. The system did not trust men to be angels, nor did it assume they would be tyrants. It expected ambition to meet ambition, power to check power, and the whole machine to stay in motion through the friction of disagreement. When the Constitution was finally ratified, first by Delaware, then Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and so on, it did not come with fireworks. Many votes were close. In some states, it only passed after promises were made that a Bill of Rights would be added immediately, that the people's liberties would be written down, unmistakable and untouchable. But it passed, and the country, for all its doubts, leaned forward into something new. But ratification did not mean unity. Not yet. In the streets, in homes, around kitchen tables, people still asked each other what kind of nation they were about to enter. Was it truly a republic for all, or simply a reshaped elite? Some clung to the hope that this document would bring order and fairness. Others feared it would only tighten the grip of those already in power. The Constitution left much unsaid. It did not define who counted as a citizen. It did not mention political parties, even though divisions were already forming. It did not settle the future of slavery, of native lands, of westward expansion. It created the scaffolding, but the building itself would be shaped over generations. And yet, despite everything it left undone, the Constitution did one thing with clarity. It offered a framework for argument, a way to disagree without unraveling, a place where power was never left in one pair of hands for too long. That was the great gamble, that a people so different by region, by class, by interest, could share the same set of rules, that laws could grow, that justice could expand, that what began as compromise might someday become conscience. It did not promise a perfect union, only a more perfect one, and that, in the end, was enough to begin. In ink we trust. It is one thing to agree on a structure. It is another to write the words that hold it together. The Constitution in its final form is just over 4,500 words long. That is shorter than many modern instruction manuals, and yet it remains one of the most scrutinized, quoted, and debated texts in human history. Every word was chosen. Every omission was deliberate. The preamble alone has inspired volumes of interpretation. We the people, three simple words that say everything and nothing. Who were the people? Did it include women, enslaved persons, native nations? At the time, most Americans could not vote. Property requirements excluded many white men, and yet they wrote it anyway, as if to signal a hope beyond their own limitations, to form a more perfect union. Not a perfect union, a more perfect one. The choice of words mattered. It acknowledged the flaws without surrendering to them. It invited improvement. It whispered, we are building something meant to grow. The articles that followed laid out a government of balance. Not balance in the poetic sense, but in the mechanical one. Like gears in a watch, like weights on a scale. Congress would make the laws. The president would carry them out. The courts would interpret them. Each branch could stop the others, but none could survive alone. It was not a new idea exactly. Montesquieu had written about separation of powers decades earlier. But here in this young republic, it was being written into law with a clarity that few had dared attempt. Still, the brilliance of the Constitution is not only in what it says, but in how much it leaves unsaid. The word democracy appears nowhere in the text. Neither does education, privacy, or even God. The framers, by design or by instinct, chose to leave space. Space for the unknown. Space for later generations to define their own terms. And then there is Article 5, the mechanism to amend. It was their way of admitting imperfection. A built-in ladder should anyone need to climb out of the holes they had left behind. It would not be easy, 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states, but it was possible. The Constitution could grow, stretch, evolve. That choice alone may have saved the nation more than once. Still, the ink had barely dried when people began to demand more. The lack of individual protections had become a rallying cry. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial. None of these appeared in the original document, and that omission threatened to unravel the hard-won ratification. Some states had only agreed to join under the promise that such rights would be added immediately. James Madison, reluctant at first, became their author. Not because he had changed his mind, but because he understood politics. The Constitution, he believed, already limited government. But to satisfy the public, he drafted a set of amendments, 10 of them, that would come to be known as the Bill of Rights. But that comes next. For now, it is worth pausing on the pages themselves. I once saw a facsimile of the original document in a quiet museum room. The parchment looked yellowed and fragile, and yet the ink had not faded. You could still see the loops in the signatures, the spacing of the lines, the final period. It struck me that this entire country, its laws, its conflicts, its culture, grew from words written with a quill. No computers, no keyboards, just ink and hope. And maybe that is what makes it feel human. Because for all its brilliance, the Constitution is not divine. It was not handed down on a mountain. It was argued over, smudged, revised. It is a human document crafted by human hands, shaped by human flaws, carried by human ambition. And it is still being written. Not literally, perhaps, but every court ruling, every protest, every election is another pen stroke. Every generation adds a question, a clause, a breath. We inherit the words, but we choose how to read them. Some say the Constitution is sacred. Others say it is outdated. But maybe it is both, a relic and a blueprint. a reminder of who we were and who we still hope to be. 3 branches and a balancing act. I remember watching a game of seesaw. Once 2 kids perfectly balanced, each pushing off the ground in turn. The moment one pushed too hard, the other would hang in the air, feet dangling, until balance was found again. That is what they were trying to build. 3 branches, each with its own power and its own limits. The legislative to make the laws, the executive to carry them out, the judiciary to interpret what they meant. It sounds simple now, but at the time it was revolutionary. Most governments concentrated power. Kings ruled by decree. Parliaments were often advisory, not supreme. Courts could be manipulated or ignored. But this new American system, it dared to trust friction. Friction they believed was not a flaw. It was a feature. If one branch moved too quickly, the others would slow it down. If one grasped too much, the others could pull it back. No single person would be above the system, not even the president, especially not the president. George Washington, the first to hold the office, understood this better than most. He had led an army. He had won a war. The people might have made him king had he asked, but he did not. He stepped back and let the structure speak for itself. He knew that precedent would be as powerful as parchment, that how the system began would shape how it endured. The Senate, for example, was designed to be slower, more deliberative, a check on the passions of the House. Senators were not even elected by the people at first. They were chosen by state legislatures. It was not until 1913 that this changed. The House of Representatives, by contrast, was meant to be close to the people, elected every 2 years, responsive to the shifting moods of the nation. It was the branch designed to breathe, with the public louder, faster, more emotional. And then came the courts. In the early days, the Supreme Court was the quietest branch. It had no building of its own. It heard few cases. But over time, its power would grow, not because of what the Constitution said, but because of what it allowed. Marbury v. Madison in 1803 changed everything. With a single ruling, the court claimed the power to strike down laws it deemed unconstitutional. Judicial review. It was not mentioned in the text, but it flowed from the logic of the system. If the Constitution was supreme, someone had to guard its boundaries. That someone became the court. But this was not balance like a scale. It was balance like a storm, shifting, unpredictable, alive. The branches did not always get along. Congress could investigate the president. The president could veto Congress. The court could overturn both. And sometimes they clashed openly. Andrew Jackson once ignored a Supreme Court ruling entirely. Franklin Roosevelt tried to expand the court when it blocked his New Deal programs. Richard Nixon tested the limits of executive power until the court said no. Each time the system strained. But it did not snap. Because underneath the conflict was an idea that no one should rule alone. That power, like water, needs channels to flow through, or else it floods. I remember hearing a senator once say that America runs not on trust, but on distrust. Not the cynicism kind, the designed kind, the kind that says we build systems not for saints but for people. People with ambition, with ego, with blind spots, and so we design systems to check them, to slow them down, to force them to talk to each other. Sometimes it feels maddening. Bills die in committee. Nominations stall. Investigations drag on for years. But that slowness is a kind of safety, a reminder that big decisions deserve resistance. I saw a documentary once, black and white, about a filibuster in the Senate. A man stood for hours reading recipes and phone books just to delay a vote. It seemed absurd. But it was the system at work, messy, human, stubborn, because the framers did not want speed. They wanted survival. And in their minds, Survival came from tension, not violence, not chaos, but healthy, structured disagreement. You can feel it still today. When a law passes by just one vote, when a justice's ruling sends shockwaves, when the branches tug at each other like siblings who both want the front seat. That is the balance. Awkward, uncomfortable, but enduring. And in that tug of war, somehow, the Republic holds. The Forgotten Voices, who was left out of We the People. I remember the first time I really looked at that phrase, We the People. It was etched into a bronze plaque in the library downtown, right next to a dusty old copy of the Constitution under glass. The letters were bold, grand, meant to inspire, and they did, but not for everyone. Because when they wrote We the People, they did not mean all of us. Not yet. In that hall in Philadelphia, there were no women at the table. Not one. There were no enslaved people, though many were just outside serving meals, holding coats, waiting. There were no Native Americans whose lands had already been taken, whose treaties would soon be broken again and again. And even among white men, not all were welcome. If you did not own land, you often could not vote. If you were poor, illiterate Catholic Jewish, or an immigrant, your place in the new republic was tentative, conditional. The Constitution, for all its vision, was also a mirror of its time, and its time was deeply unequal. In the southern states, slavery was the backbone of the economy. Human beings were property by law, sold, whipped, inherited. Families torn apart, lives measured in labor. It is hard to say that out loud even now, but it was true, and the Constitution did not abolish it. In fact, it protected it. It included the 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, not for their benefit, but to boost the political power of slaveholding states. It included a clause allowing the capture of runaway slaves across state lines. And it did not include the word slavery, perhaps out of shame, or perhaps out of strategy. But the system was built with it in mind. I once visited Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. It is beautiful, perched on a hill, with gardens and porches that stretch out over the Virginia countryside. But below, there are brick quarters, tight, hot, and quiet now, where enslaved people once lived and worked. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, and he owned over 600 human beings. This contradiction is not an easy thing to sit with, but we must sit with it, because the greatness of the American experiment does not erase its exclusions, and those exclusions echoed loudly. Women, for example, would wait over a century to vote, and even then, not all women. Black women in the South faced poll taxes, literacy tests, and threats of violence. Native American women were not recognized as citizens until 1924, and immigrant women could be denied based on origin or language. They fought anyway. I remember seeing old photographs, black and white, grainy, of suffragists in white dresses marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, holding signs that said, "Votes for Women." Some were jailed. Some were force-fed during hunger strikes. But they kept marching, because they knew that we the people should mean all of us. Black Americans had an even harder path. After slavery was abolished in 1865, the promise of citizenship came quickly in law, at least. The 14th and 15th Amendments, equal protection, the right to vote. But in practice, there were lynchings, there were Jim Crow laws, there were schools with no books, towns with no voting booths. The Constitution promised dignity. The country offered delay, and yet they still rose. There were teachers who taught in secret, churches that turned into organizing centers, veterans who returned from war and demanded the rights they had fought for abroad. and teenagers like the ones in Little Rock who walked into hostile schools with their heads held high, because they too believed in the words, even when the country did not. Native Americans had to fight not only for inclusion, but for recognition. For decades, they were not considered part of the people at all. They were treated as wards of the state-separate nations within a nation. Even those who served in the military were denied full citizenship. I saw a photo once of a Navajo code talker from World War II, his uniform crisp, his medals shining. And I thought, how strange to serve a country that does not yet see you as fully its own. But that was America too. And the fight continued. Latino farm workers organized for fair wages. Asian immigrants demanded the right to become citizens. LGBTQ Americans pushed for marriage for military service, for simple acknowledgement. And each time the Constitution was tested, each time we the people was stretched a little wider. That is the strange beauty of it. The Constitution was written by imperfect men. It was born in compromise, shaped by exclusion, and yet it contained within it the seeds of change. Because it did not lock the doors, it left them ajar. Amendments could be added. Courts could reinterpret. People could rise again and say, "You forgot about me." And slowly, painfully, the document would answer back, "We see you now." I remember walking past that bronze plaque again, years later. The same words still carved, "We the people." But this time, I thought about all the hands that had pushed their way into that sentence. Hands calloused from cotton fields, hands ink-stained from protest signs, hands shaking from fear, from hope, from exhaustion. They made it their own. And maybe that is the real meaning of the phrase, not as a statement, but as a question. Who is we? Who gets to belong? And how do we keep expanding that circle? Because history is not just about the powerful men who built the house. It is also about those who knocked on the door year after year, until someone finally let them in. The Bill of Rights, freedom carved in paper. I remember being a boy sitting at the kitchen table while my father unfolded the newspaper, and there it was on the front page, something about freedom of speech. Or maybe it was the Second Amendment, or due process. I did not understand it then, but I saw the way my father's eyes narrowed, the way his hand stilled over his coffee. Whatever it was, it mattered. And over time, I learned why. Because when the Constitution was first written, something was missing. It was a sturdy frame, yes, branches of government checks and balances structure, but it did not speak much about the people themselves. Not about their daily lives, not about their rights. It laid out what the government could do, but not clearly enough what it could not. And people noticed. There was unrest in the taverns, in the town halls. They said, "How can we trust this new government without guarantees? What if it turns on us? What if it becomes like the king we just broke away from?" It was not paranoia. It was memory. Many had lived through the search warrants, the quartering of soldiers, the censorship, the trials without jury. They knew what unchecked power looked like, and they wanted protection on paper in ink for everyone to see. That is how the Bill of Rights was born. James Madison did not originally want amendments. He thought the Constitution spoke for itself. But as states debated ratification, the pressure grew. Virginia, New York, and others demanded explicit safeguards. So Madison changed his mind. And in 1789, he proposed 12 amendments. 10 of them were ratified by the states. Together, they became the Bill of Rights. They were short, simple, and powerful. The first said that Congress could not make laws controlling religion or the press or free speech. People could protest, could assemble, could petition the government. It was a shield for ideas. The second protected the right to bear arms, a phrase that would echo through centuries, debated in courts, in living rooms, in schoolhouses. The third said no soldier could live in your home without permission, a memory from the Revolution, carved into law. The fourth shielded against unreasonable searches and seizures. No more breaking down doors without cause. No more rummaging through a man's papers in the dark of night. The fifth said you could not be forced to testify against yourself. You had the right to remain silent, to due process, to fair compensation if your land was taken. The sixth and seventh protected trials by jury, by peers in public, with a lawyer, with a clock that could not stretch forever. The eighth banned cruel and unusual punishment. It did not say exactly what that meant, but it told the government be humane. And the ninth and 10th reminded everyone that the people and the states had powers beyond those written down. That freedom was not a checklist, it was a principle. I remember learning all this in school, in a room that smelled of chalk and sunshine, while the teacher traced the amendments on the blackboard with slow, deliberate strokes. She said, "These are not perfect, but they are promises, and promises once made are hard to take back." And it is true. The Bill of Rights did not cover everyone, not at first. Enslaved people had no protection. Women's voices were still unheard. Native Americans were not considered citizens, but the words were there, and over time they were used, invoked, expanded, stretched, until more and more people were included. Frederick Douglass once asked, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" And still he believed in the Constitution's words, because he knew they could be turned against injustice. Susan B. Anthony stood trial for voting while female. She quoted the 14th Amendment in her defense. "We are persons," she said. "We have the right." Thurgood Marshall argued before the Supreme Court that segregated schools violated the 14th Amendment. That separate was not equal, that the Constitution, if it meant anything, had to mean fairness. And the Bill of Rights was there, silent, but present, in every courtroom, every protest, every plea. I remember watching grainy footage of a march across a bridge in Selma, Alabama. Peaceful marchers beaten by state troopers, their crime assembling, demanding voting rights. And yet the Constitution, even battered by time and contradiction, stood with them. Because once you put words like freedom of speech or equal protection into law, they become tools. They become weapons of peace. And the Bill of Rights gave people those tools. Some of the amendments became rallying cries, the first especially. It protected the press, which meant newspapers could question presidents. It protected speech, which meant citizens could criticize wars. It protected religion, which meant you could pray or not pray without fear. And it protected the right to gather to chant, to hold up signs in the cold, in the rain, in the heat of summer. I remember seeing a photo, once students kneeling in silence after a school shooting. No words, just stillness. That too was protected speech. And yet freedom is never easy. The Bill of Rights has been tested again and again. During wartime, during fear, during change. There were times when speech was punished, when homes were searched, when people were jailed for what they believed. But the amendments endured, because people kept coming back to them. Lawyers, activists, parents, teenagers. They came with lawsuits, with stories, with hope. And each time the courts had to reckon with the same question: what does freedom mean? Today I remember just a few years ago standing in a courtroom as a juror. The judge read from a script, but his voice was steady. He reminded us of the presumption of innocence, of the right to a fair trial. I looked around at the 12 of us, different ages, backgrounds, hair colors, and I thought this is what they meant. Not a perfect system, but a promise. carved in paper, and still holding. Fragile and forever. The Constitution in our time. I was older then, gray at the temples, the kind of age where the news begins to sound familiar, where you catch yourself saying things like, "We've been here before." And one morning, I was holding a mug of coffee, half watching the television. A crowd was waving signs, some angry, some hopeful. The anchor said it was about rights again, always about rights. And I remember thinking, not with despair, but with a strange kind of calm, this is what the Constitution was made for. Not the quiet times, the hard ones. Because if you look at the history of our Constitution, it is not the story of a flawless plan. It is the story of a living argument. That is how it was written. With gaps, with contradictions, with beauty. It was not finished in 1787, and it was not supposed to be. It was made to bend, not break. That is why they built in amendments. That is why they left things open-ended. The founders knew they were not gods. They were farmers and lawyers and soldiers. They had seen enough to know that power can rot and good intentions can fail. So, they made a framework strong enough to last and loose enough to grow. And it has. Over the decades, the Constitution has been everything from a shield to a sword. It has protected dissenters. It has failed victims. It has freed slaves and ignored injustice. It has survived civil war, survived corruption, survived attempts to twist it, to stretch it, to tear it apart. And it has been rewritten, not with fire and rebellion, but with ink and ballots. I remember when they passed the 19th Amendment. My grandmother used to say she was 24 when women finally got the vote. She stood in a dress she had made herself in line with her neighbors trembling. She said, "I knew the world would not change in a day." But that morning I felt taller. And later, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. They were not amendments, but they breathed new life into the Constitution. They reminded us that the words only live if we enforce them. I remember Watergate, the way the country held its breath, the hearings, the tapes, the resignation. And yet the Constitution held. The system worked not perfectly, not painlessly, but it worked. And I remember after 9/11, when fear ran faster than facts, when we asked, how much freedom can we give up in the name of safety? And for how long? The Constitution did not give easy answers, but it gave boundaries. It reminded us that even terror does not erase rights. Then came social media, a world where speech is instant, endless, and often cruel, where lies spread faster than truth, where privacy shrinks by the second. And once again, we turned to the Constitution. What is free speech in the age of algorithms? What is due process when data knows you better than your friends? No one has solved it yet. But the debate, the reckoning, the questions, that is the process. That is the Republic. I once read that the Constitution is not a map. It is a compass. It does not tell you exactly where to go, but it keeps pointing north. And we need that now, more than ever. Because there have been cracks. There have always been cracks. Moments when partisanship outweighed principle, when power went unchecked, when courts bent too far or not far enough, when the meaning of words like freedom, justice, equality felt like they were written in disappearing ink. But then people showed up, to vote, to speak, to march, to listen. And suddenly the old words came alive again. I remember watching a young girl recite the preamble in a classroom on TV. Her voice was small but clear. We the people. And something about the way she said it, like she meant it, made me think maybe we are not finished after all. Maybe that is the point, that we never are. The Constitution is not a relic. It is not behind glass. It is not just the parchment in the archives faded and fragile under spotlights. It is the argument in the kitchen, the case in the courtroom, the chant in the crowd, the whisper in the voting booth. It is fragile, but it is also forever, as long as someone remembers, as long as someone keeps asking, what kind of country do we want to be, and listens for the answer. I think about that sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, when the stars look older than time, and I remember something my mother once said as she folded laundry and listened to the radio, the Bill of Rights playing in the background like a hymn. She said, "Freedom is not what they give you. It is what you refuse to lose." And then she tucked the sheets under the mattress, smoothed the corners, and hummed a song I can no longer name. Maybe that is how the Constitution survives. Not just in law, but in living, in rhythm, in memory. Tonight may you rest easy. The words are still there, and so are we. Ratification at last, with a promise. Yet to keep by the summer of 1788. Something remarkable had happened. After months of fierce debates in newspapers, candlelit meetings in town halls, and the occasional shouting match across dinner tables, the United States Constitution had finally been ratified. It was not unanimous, and it was not without worry, but it was done. Still, the victory was not whole. Many of the states had only agreed to ratify under one condition, that the document would be amended to include protections for individual rights. The Constitution, brilliant and bold, as it was, said little about the everyday freedoms of ordinary people. The right to speak your mind, to practice your faith, to be safe in your own home. These were things many Americans felt should not be left to interpretation. They wanted guarantees. So, in the quiet that followed the storm of ratification, the promise of a Bill of Rights loomed large, and at the center of that promise was a young Virginian who had once been skeptical of changing the Constitution at all, James Madison. He had not always believed a Bill of Rights was necessary, but now, seeing how fragile the Union still was, Madison recognized that if this grand experiment in self-government was to survive, the people needed to see their freedoms inked into the parchment of the nation's founding law. In the winter of 1789, Madison got to work. He pored over the various declarations of rights already written by state governments. Virginia had one. So did Pennsylvania. He reread the debates from the Constitutional Convention and paid special attention to the objections that had nearly unraveled the entire process. What emerged was a careful selection, a list of 12 proposed amendments that would reassure the public without unraveling the delicate balance struck between federal and state powers. 12. That was the original number, not 10. He introduced them in June 1789 during the First Congress, and almost immediately the debates began again. Not about whether people had rights, but about how best to state them. Every word mattered. Could Congress really limit speech if it never had the authority in the first place? Did putting these rights on paper suggest that others did not exist? These were not just semantic debates. They were philosophical battles over the soul of a country not yet 2 decades old. Still, over the next year, the proposed amendments were refined. Some were dropped. Others were revised. By the time they were sent out to the states for ratification in September of 1789, the list had been trimmed to 10 core protections. These 10 would become known as the Bill of Rights. But even then, ratification was not immediate. States took their time. Some argued that the amendments did not go far enough. Others feared they went too far, and there were many who simply believed that actions, not words, would prove the government's respect for liberty. It was not until December 15, 1791, that Virginia became the crucial 11th state to ratify. With that, the Bill of Rights officially became part of the Constitution, and the timing could not have been better. Because while the ink was still drying, tensions within the young nation were already beginning to rise again. Political factions were hardening. Washington would soon step down, and the country would soon be tested in ways no one had quite imagined. But through it all, there was now a foundation, a list of rights that ordinary citizens could point to and say, "These are mine." Some of them were simple: the right to speak, to assemble, to practice religion. Others were more obscure: the right to avoid quartering soldiers in your home during peacetime. Some would grow in importance over time, like the protections against unreasonable search and seizure, or the right to a speedy trial. Together, they formed the guardrails of a new kind of government, one that dared to say, "Power does not come from kings or parliaments. It comes from the people." It is easy to forget now, more than 2 centuries later, just how radical that was, just how uncertain. The Bill of Rights did not fix everything. It did not solve the deep injustices that still haunted the nation. But it gave Americans something they had never truly had before: a written promise. A promise that no matter how powerful the government became, the individual still mattered. That no matter how loud the arguments got in Congress, there were some things no law could take away. That promise would be tested again and again, in courts, in protests, in classrooms, and sometimes even on battlefields. But it started here in these 10 amendments, born not from certainty, but from compromise. Not from perfection, but from the need to protect what was most fragile: freedom itself. 12 proposed. 10 adopted. James Madison did not write the Bill of Rights in a single sitting, nor did he believe it would be his legacy. In fact, he once feared that writing down a list of rights could backfire, limiting freedoms rather than protecting them. But history, it seems, had other plans. When the dust settled from the Constitutional Convention and the bitter arguments of ratification had cooled to a simmer, Madison saw what needed to be done. He had opposed adding a Bill of Rights during the drafting of the Constitution. But now, as the young nation found its footing, he changed his mind, not because he suddenly thought it essential, but because he saw that others did. If the Constitution was the bones of the new republic, then the Bill of Rights would be its breath. So, in the spring of 1789, Madison sat down to write. He was 38 years old, slim and often ill, but his mind moved like quicksilver. His desk in the House of Representatives in New York, where the first Congress met before the Capitol moved to Philadelphia, became a quiet workshop of compromise and precision. He reviewed over 200 suggested amendments submitted by the states. From these, he carved out what he believed were the core protections the people demanded and the government could accept. The original draft had 12 amendments. Yes, 12. 2 of them, one about congressional pay raises and the other about apportioning representation in the House, did not pass at the time. One would be ratified much later in 1992, and the other was never adopted. But the remaining 10 passed into law and became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Each of them carried weight far beyond its words. The First Amendment, of course, has become a symbol unto itself. But even within the 10 that were passed, each one had a story crafted carefully by Madison and honed through debate. The Second Amendment, for instance, was not the subject of much controversy in its time. In a post-revolutionary society, the idea that citizens should be armed as part of a militia was not particularly radical. The memory of British soldiers marching through towns had not yet faded. The Third Amendment about quartering troops in private homes seems almost quaint today. But in the 18th century, it was a bitter memory. Colonists had been forced to house British soldiers, sometimes for months, and the humiliation lingered. The Fourth through Eighth Amendments built a kind of fortress around the individual, especially when facing the power of the state. Unreasonable searches, arbitrary arrests, cruel punishments, these were not abstract fears. They were scars from life under colonial rule. Madison's language was elegant but direct. These amendments were not philosophical meditations. They were protections you could point to when the knock came at your door. And yet, even then, he worried. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, Madison admitted that he was unsure whether these amendments would truly guard liberty. He feared that rights on paper could be easily ignored, that the momentum of power might drown out principle. But he also hoped, and he believed, that even if the Bill of Rights could not prevent every injustice, it could provide a foundation on which to fight them. The amendments passed both houses of Congress in September 1789 and were sent to the states for ratification. It took over 2 years, and not every state embraced them with the same urgency. But eventually, enough of them did. By December 15, 1791, 10 of Madison's amendments had become the law of the land. They did not stop injustice. They did not end inequality. But they gave Americans something no government had ever offered before: a written promise that the individual, even the quietest one, had power. These 10 amendments would become the seeds of countless court cases, movements, and revolutions of conscience. Abolitionists would cite them. Suffragists would lean on them. Civil rights leaders would carry them in their pockets. Journalists, protesters, teachers, and ordinary citizens would invoke them when the world turned harsh. And as for Madison, he did not live long enough to see the full legacy of what he had written. But before he died in 1836, he came to believe that the Bill of Rights was not merely a political compromise, it was a moral compass. In later years, he would downplay his authorship, as if uncomfortable taking too much credit. He knew perhaps better than anyone that freedom is never finished. It must be written again, in every generation, tested by every crisis, and defended by every citizen. The parchment may have been his, but the rights belonged to the people. The First Amendment Speech Press, Faith and Protest. The First Amendment begins simply. 25 words that became a cornerstone of American Identity Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And with that, a wall was built. Invisible, but powerful. A wall between church and state, between government and the thoughts inside your head. James Madison didn't invent the idea, but he sculpted it into law. He had grown up in Virginia, where the Anglican Church once reigned supreme, and where Baptists were jailed for preaching without a license. He had seen the bruises that government-backed religion could leave, and he wanted a different kind of country. The First Amendment was Madison's answer to that. But it went further. Religion was only the beginning, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Words had helped spark the revolution. Pamphlets, sermons, tavern speeches. The founders knew that silence was the ally of tyranny. So they wrote into the law a promise: the right to speak, to publish, to shout into the town square, even if no one agreed with you. Or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. In other words, protest, march, gather, complain. You do not need permission to care. It was bold. No other country had ever committed in writing to protecting these freedoms for its people. And yet the promise was only as good as the people who believed in it. The ink was barely dry before that belief was tested. In 1798, just 7 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Among other things, they made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. People were arrested. One man, a congressman named Matthew Lyon, was jailed for criticizing President John Adams. He wrote letters from his cell and won re-election while still imprisoned. But the message was clear. The First Amendment's protections could vanish under pressure. The laws were later repealed, and history judged them harshly. But they served as a reminder. The Bill of Rights is not a shield, unless someone is willing to hold it up. Over the next 2 centuries, the First Amendment would grow in meaning. The courts would stretch its limbs. Protesters would test its strength. Presidents would try to ignore it. And ordinary people would use it in extraordinary ways. In 1835, a black newspaper editor named Elijah Lovejoy was murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois. His crime printing articles that opposed slavery. The killers were never punished. But Lovejoy became a martyr for free speech, and abolitionists began to see the First Amendment not as theory, but as a battlefield. Decades later, suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton used the First Amendment as both sword and shield. They printed newspapers, held rallies, and delivered fiery speeches in public squares. They were heckled, arrested, even beaten, but they would not be silenced. In 1919, during World War I, the Supreme Court ruled on the case of Schenck versus United States. Charles Schenck had distributed leaflets opposing the military draft and was arrested under the Espionage Act. The court upheld his conviction, famously stating that free speech does not include the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. But that same ruling planted seeds. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote the opinion, would later change course, helping lay the foundation for stronger protections of dissent. By the 1960s, the First Amendment became the heartbeat of the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the Lincoln Memorial and declared, "I have a dream." His voice echoed through a crowd of 250,000 people peacefully assembled. The march was protected by the same words Madison had written nearly 2 centuries before, and yet not all voices were welcomed. During the Vietnam War, protesters burned flags and draft cards. In the 1980s, artists pushed boundaries with provocative works that offended nearly everyone. Each time, Americans argued, what counts as speech? What is too far? The answers were not always comfortable, but again and again, the courts returned to the same idea. The First Amendment is not designed to protect polite speech. It is meant to protect the dangerous kind. It is a paradox. A country built on unity must also allow dissonance. A government must tolerate insults against itself. A people must defend the rights of those they despise, because if those rights disappear, so do everyone else's. Even today, the debates continue. On college campuses, in social media, at school board meetings. Free speech is not a solved equation. It is a living argument. And yet, in all its messiness, the First Amendment endures. It does not promise that your words will be popular, or that your beliefs will be safe from criticism. It only promises that you can speak them, and that the government cannot stop you. Madison may not have foreseen TikTok or 24-hour news cycles. He could not have imagined protests streamed live or anonymous posts that go viral in seconds. But he understood something deeper, that freedom begins in the mind, travels through the voice, and lives in the act of being heard. And so the First Amendment remains a whisper across the centuries, a reminder that democracy is noisy, uncomfortable, and fragile, but worth every word. Guns, privacy, and liberty on the frontier. If the First Amendment is the soul of American liberty, the next 3 are its guard dogs. The Second Amendment is just one sentence, but its meaning has been debated for over 2 centuries. a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. To the men who wrote it, this was not theory, it was survival. In 1789, the British had only recently marched into homes and disarmed American colonists. The revolution had depended on militias, groups of farmers and tradesmen with muskets. The memory of being defenseless was still raw. So they wrote down a promise: you can fight back. Of course, they were thinking of flintlocks and powder horns. They could not have imagined automatic weapons or school shootings. But in their world, a gun was more than a tool. It was a symbol of resistance, of independence, of not needing to ask permission. Even then, the meaning was murky. Was the right collective or individual? Did it protect militias or every person? That ambiguity would fuel lawsuits, protests, and tragedies for generations. In 2008, the Supreme Court finally ruled in District of Columbia versus Heller that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess firearms for self-defense. But even that decision left doors open and debates burning. Behind every headline, there is a tension between liberty and safety, between frontier spirit and modern fear. And behind all of that is a single question no law can fully answer. What do we owe each other? The founders didn't settle that, but they tried to set boundaries. That brings us to the Third Amendment. It reads, "No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner." At first glance, it seems quaint, irrelevant. But in the 1770s, British soldiers were being housed in American homes without permission. It was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating. A symbol that the people were not in charge of their own country or even their own beds. So the framers made it clear, your home is your own. No one can take that from you, not even the army. In practice, the Third Amendment is rarely cited. There have been almost no major court cases about it. But its spirit, privacy, property, dignity echoes throughout the Constitution. And it leads us directly into the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. This is the first time the Constitution says, clearly and directly, you have the right to be left alone. It came from hard experience. The British had used writs of assistance, vague warrants, that allowed them to search homes, ships, or shops without clear reason. They could ransack a warehouse on suspicion, seize property, without proof, and never face consequences. Americans had not forgotten. They built the Fourth Amendment as a wall of protection. If the government wants to come inside, it needs a good reason and a warrant. Today, that promise touches everything, from the lock on your front door to the password on your phone. Can the police search your car without permission? Can the government read your emails? Can your location data be tracked without your consent? Courts wrestle with these questions every year. Technology changes, but the core idea remains. Freedom is not just the ability to speak or worship. It is the space to exist, unwatched, unbothered, unafraid. These three amendments, guns, soldiers, and searches, might seem disconnected, but together, they draw a picture of early America. A country suspicious of power, shaped by recent war, and determined never to be ruled again. They speak of a people who had just thrown off a king and had no interest in replacing him with another form of tyranny. Not from outside, not from within. There's a strange beauty in their simplicity. No legal jargon, no footnotes, just direct instructions to keep the government at arm's length. But they also reflect a country in transition. A country where self-defense was not an abstract right, but a daily necessity. Where the line between military and civilian was still blurry. Where privacy was more than a luxury, It was a fence against domination. And they raise a question. How do we apply 18th century fears to 21st century problems? When the Second Amendment was written, there were no standing police forces, no organized military as we know it, no mass surveillance, no biometric databases, no digital footprints. Yet here we are, still arguing about the same rights, still trying to draw lines that protect freedom without inviting chaos. There are no easy answers, only constant negotiation. And perhaps that is the point. The Bill of Rights was not designed as a perfect map. It was a compass, a set of guiding stars, a reminder that even a free nation must always ask itself, whose freedom, at what cost? In that sense, these amendments are not relics. They are warnings, they are hopes, and they are questions we still struggle to answer every time a siren wails, a door is kicked in, a protest erupts, or a vote is cast. What the Constitution didn't protect slaves, women, natives. For all its eloquence and daring, the Constitution was never perfect, not even close. It said, "we the people," but the definition of people was heartbreakingly narrow. If you were enslaved, if you were a woman, if you were Native American, you were not really included. The words on the parchment were powerful, but the silences were louder. Slavery was the deepest of those silences. The framers could not agree on how to confront it. So, they danced around it. They never used the word slavery in the original text. Instead, they spoke in shadows. The 3/5 clause declared that for purposes of representation, a slave would count as 3/5 of a person. Not a full citizen, not a full human, just enough to give the southern states more seats in Congress, without giving those enslaved any voice at all. Then there was the fugitive slave clause. If an enslaved person escaped to a free state, they were to be returned. Even in freedom, they could not stay free. In 1787, there were delegates in that room who hated slavery. But many of them accepted the compromise, because they feared that without the southern states, there would be no constitution at all. Unity, they believed, required silence. That silence would cost generations everything. As for women, their exclusion was quieter, but just as clear. They were not given the vote. They were not expected to hold office, serve on juries, or sign legal contracts. The Constitution did not ban these things outright. It simply assumed they were not for women. It took over a century and one of the most organized grassroots movements in American history to change that. Women marched, they wrote, they protested, they went to jail. They fought through ridicule, violence, and indifference. And still, when the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, over 130 years after the Constitution was signed, it did not declare women equal. It only said they could not be denied the right to vote on account of sex. It was a victory, but not a full reckoning. And then there were the native peoples, the original inhabitants of this land. They were not citizens. They were not protected. They were not even really acknowledged. The Constitution gave Congress the power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes, but said nothing about rights treaties or sovereignty. It treated native nations as curiosities, obstacles, not neighbors. In the decades that followed, those omissions would become policies. Forced removals, broken promises, trails of tears. It is tempting to believe that the Constitution was simply a product of its time, that the men who wrote it were limited by the world they lived in. That is true. But it is also a warning, because those limits were not just historical, they were chosen. The framers could imagine liberty from kings and armies, but they struggled to imagine liberty for everyone. And yet the miracle of the Constitution is that it could grow. It was built with space for correction, with amendments, with the idea that what is right today may not be enough tomorrow. It is why abolitionists clung to the Declaration of Independence, which said that all men are created equal, even when the Constitution did not treat them that way. It is why Sojourner Truth could ask, "Ain't I a woman?" and make the country listen. It is why Native activists continue to fight for land, for rights, for history, to be seen, not as part of the past, but part of the present. The Constitution was flawed, but it was not finished. And maybe that is the most American thing about it. We are a nation that declares ideals before we are ready to live them. That writes promises we do not yet know how to keep. That says liberty and justice for all, and then stumbles toward it, one painful, stubborn step at a time. What the Constitution left out says as much about America as what it included. The brilliance, the blind spots, the hope. Each generation has had to decide, is this document enough? Can it be better? Who still waits to be included? Those are not legal questions. They are moral ones. And the answers are not written in ink. They are written in action. The Constitution is not a holy relic. It is a living challenge, and it asks again and again, who gets to belong? Amendments that changed everything. Freedom, votes, and equality. The Constitution was born in 1787, but in many ways it did not come of age until much later, because while the framers gave the country a foundation, it was the amendments, the changes, the additions that brought the House to life. Some of those changes were small, technical, procedural, but others were thunderclaps. They rewrote the meaning of citizenship, of equality, of who mattered in America. The most seismic shift came in the ashes of war. The Civil War tore the nation apart. More than 600,000 dead, cities burned, families broken, and at the heart of it all was the question the Constitution had left unanswered. Could a nation built on liberty also be built on slavery? The answer at last was no. And in the years that followed, the Constitution changed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, not just in name, but in law. No more compromise clauses. No more returns to bondage. It was the first time the Constitution spoke clearly about freedom for all. The 14th Amendment went even further. It declared that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, that states could not deny any person equal protection under the law, that the rights of individuals were not just protected from kings, but from state governments too. It was a radical idea, citizenship as a shield, equality as a constitutional promise. Then came the 15th Amendment. It said that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Together, these three amendments were called the Reconstruction Amendments. And for a brief, shining moment, they offered the possibility of a new America, one where formerly enslaved people could vote, hold office, live freely. But that moment did not last. Violence returned. So did suppression. New laws like poll taxes and literacy tests found ways to gut those amendments without tearing them down. The words remained. The reality vanished. It would take nearly a century for those promises to be reclaimed. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. After generations of organizing, of marching, of being told to wait, the door finally opened. And yet for many women of color, the vote remained out of reach. Legal barriers, intimidation, voter suppression. The letter of the law changed. The struggle did not. It was not until the 1960s that the Constitution's promise of equality was truly tested again. The civil rights movement was more than marches and speeches. It was a demand that the Constitution mean what it said. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act, though not an amendment, enforced the 15th Amendment with real teeth. The Supreme Court began to interpret the 14th Amendment not as a dusty relic, but as a living guarantee of fairness. School desegregation, marriage equality, due process, the right to counsel. The idea that the government could not just pass laws, it had to pass fair ones. The Constitution did not hand these rights down. People had to pull them from its words like stones from the earth. Every generation faced its own wall, and every generation chipped away. Young people won the right to vote at 18 with the 26th Amendment after being sent to fight in Vietnam at the same age. The 22nd Amendment limited presidents to 2 terms after the nation watched Franklin D. Roosevelt serve 4. The 25th clarified presidential succession after John F. Kennedy was killed, and the country realized it needed clearer rules for tragedy. Some proposed amendments never passed, like the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have guaranteed gender equality in explicit terms. It came close, but it never quite made it across the finish line. Still, the Constitution had grown, from 7 articles to 27 amendments, from property-holding white men to a broader, messier, more inclusive democracy. It is not perfect. It never was. But it bends, it listens, it changes when pushed hard enough. And that may be its most enduring trait, not just what it says, but how it allows Americans to say more, to demand more, to dream bigger than the parchment. The hardest tests war terror and the digital age. The Constitution was never meant to be easy. It was meant to endure. But endurance, as America would learn, is not passive. It gets tested, and tested again, in fire, in fear, in silence. The 20th century came like a freight train. Industrial power, world wars, nuclear weapons, the Great Depression, civil unrest. And through it all, the Constitution was asked again and again, "Are you still enough?" World War I was the first to ask. In 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, making it a crime to interfere with the draft or support America's enemies. A year later, the Sedition Act made it illegal to speak against the government during wartime. Thousands were arrested, newspapers shut down, people imprisoned just for handing out leaflets. The Supreme Court upheld it. In the famous Schenck v. United States case, the court introduced the idea of clear and present danger. The First Amendment, they said, was not absolute. You could not shout fire in a crowded theater. But who got to decide what counted as fire? Then came the Second World War. And with it, one of the Constitution's darkest failures. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps. They were American citizens. Most had done nothing but live on the wrong coast at the wrong time. The Constitution said nothing about race-based imprisonment, but fear spoke louder. In Korematsu v. United States, the Supreme Court upheld the internment policy. National security, they said, could justify extraordinary measures. It would take until 1988 for the U.S. government to formally apologize. The Constitution had bent, and not in the good way. But not all tests were failures. In the aftermath of the war, America began reckoning with fairness and rights in deeper ways. The civil rights movement turned the Constitution into a living document again. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education ruled school segregation unconstitutional. The logic, the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection. It was a turning point. But change came slowly. Meanwhile, new challenges emerged. In the 1970s, after the Watergate scandal, the Constitution faced another question. Could a president be held accountable? The answer was yes. The Supreme Court ruled that President Nixon had to hand over tapes of his Oval Office conversations. Congress began impeachment proceedings. Nixon resigned. The system had held, barely. Then came terrorism. On a clear September morning in 2001, planes struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Thousands died, and the country changed. The Patriot Act was passed in record time. It expanded surveillance powers, wiretaps, detentions, secret courts, all in the name of national security. Again, the Constitution was asked to choose between liberty and fear. Could the Fourth Amendment, the one about unreasonable searches, survive the age of mass data? Could the Fifth, the one about due process, mean anything when people were held in Guantanamo Bay for years without trial? The courts struggled. So did the people. And then came the Internet. Suddenly, the First Amendment wasn't about leaflets and newspapers. It was about social media algorithms and misinformation. The Second Amendment wasn't about muskets. It was about AR-15s. The Fourth Amendment wasn't about knocking on doors. It was about tracking cell phones, scanning emails, reading messages before you hit send. The Constitution, written with quill pens, now had to govern a world of satellites, data breaches, deep fakes. What does freedom of the press mean when everyone is the press? What does privacy mean when your refrigerator knows what time you wake up? The questions kept coming, in times of peace, in times of panic, after every shooting, every protest, every leak, every tweet. The Constitution was stretched, twisted, held up like a mirror, and sometimes like a shield. Sometimes it broke hearts. Sometimes it saved lives. It was never easy, but it was still there. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. Modern battles: guns, abortion, and data privacy. The Constitution was never frozen in 1787. It breathed, it bent, it adapted. But in the modern era, that breath sometimes became a gasp. The Second Amendment. 27 words written with powdered wigs and muskets in mind had become the center of one of the most polarizing debates in American life. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Simple on its face, a labyrinth in practice. What did militia mean? Could it mean you and your AR-15? Was it about hunting self-defense or resisting tyranny? In 2008, in District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protected an individual's right to own a firearm for personal use. Gun rights activists cheered, others mourned. Because while the founders had imagined muskets, America now faced mass shootings in schools, in churches, in supermarkets. After each tragedy, the nation asked, is this what the Second Amendment was meant to protect? And every time the Constitution stood silent, because it was never meant to speak. It only listened and waited. Meanwhile, another constitutional war was raging over bodies. The right to privacy, never explicitly stated in the Constitution, had been read into it by courts through the 14th Amendment's guarantee of liberty. In 1973, that reading led to Roe v. Wade. The ruling gave women the right to choose abortion in the early stages of pregnancy. It was seen by many as a triumph of autonomy, of dignity. But to others, it was murder, sanctioned by the state. And for 50 years, the battle lines never moved far. Then, in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. The right to abortion was no longer federally protected. It would now depend on where you lived, on your state, on your legislature. For millions, the ground shifted under their feet. The Constitution, once seen as a guardian of modern rights, had stepped back. It raised a haunting question. Could rights be taken away, once given? And yet, another front had already opened one the founders could never have imagined. Data. In a world where your phone knew more about you than your spouse, what did privacy mean? Could the government read your texts, track your location, buy your data from a third-party vendor? The Fourth Amendment spoke of unreasonable searches and seizures, but it had never heard of cookies' facial recognition or smart speakers recording your living room arguments. The courts scrambled, Congress lagged, technology sprinted ahead, and the people many barely noticed, because convenience is seductive, and rights once invisible are hard to miss until they are gone. One case in 2018, Carpenter vs. United States, offered a small beacon. The Supreme Court ruled that the government needed a warrant to access your cell phone's location history. It was a nod to the idea that digital life deserved constitutional shelter, but it was only a start. Because now your genetic data sits in private databases. Your online activity feeds algorithms that know your next move, and your very face is scanned, stored, analyzed. The Constitution did not ask for this future, but it got it anyway. So Americans debate over guns, over choice, over data, over which rights matter most, over what the founders meant, over what they could never have meant. And in that debate, the Constitution lives not in silence but in shouting, not in certainty but in argument. Because rights are not bricks in a wall. They are threads in a tapestry. Pull one too hard, and the rest may unravel. So the Constitution stretches. Sometimes it holds, sometimes it does not. But it endures. Because we make it endure. Because we argue over it. Because we still believe it matters, even when we disagree on what it means, especially then. Why has it lasted so long? The Constitution's strange resilience. The Constitution is the oldest written national constitution still in use, not because it is perfect, not because it is holy, but because it learned to bend before it ever dared to break. That is the real mystery, not why it was written, but why it still stands. Because most constitutions crumble, they tear under pressure, they vanish with coups, or collapse under irrelevance. France is on its fifth republic. Italy rewrote its after the war. The Soviet Union had 4 constitutions. None survived its fall, but America's it remains. So we ask how some say it is because the founders were geniuses. They were not. They were human. Brilliant in some ways, blind in others. They argued, they compromised, they left scars. They protected liberty, but also slavery. They built democracy, but let only landowners vote. Their words were soaring, but their actions were flawed. Yet what they gave us was not answers. It was architecture. The Constitution is not a conclusion. It is a framework. It creates a government, but it does not control it. It lays out branches, checks, balances like scaffolding. What we build on it is ours to choose, and that is the secret. The Constitution works because it expects to be challenged. It was born from rebellion, shaped by debate, tested by war, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, from the Great Depression to 9/11, from the Red Scare to Watergate. Each time someone said, "This will break it," and each time it bent instead. It bent when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. It bent when Roosevelt tried to pack the court. It bent when Nixon defied subpoenas. And when the pressure lifted, it snapped back, not always perfectly, but with memory. That is not strength of stone. It is strength of sinew. It is why the document is both revered and revised. There are 27 amendments, each one a fingerprint of a generation. Some came from dreams like abolishing slavery. Some came from fear, like prohibition. Some came from shame, like repealing prohibition. Each one is a reminder that the Constitution is not just a document, it is a dialogue, and it continues Because we continue it. Through court cases and protests, through petitions and op-eds, through votes. Not every generation agrees on what it means. That is the point. Because the Constitution does not demand agreement. It demands engagement. That is how it breathes. Ask anyone who has become a citizen after the test, the swearing in the ceremony. They are handed a small copy of the Constitution. Not a flag, not a rifle, not even a tax form, a booklet, a promise, a challenge. It says, "This is yours now. It is old, but it is not finished. Make it better." And they do. With every lawsuit, with every protest sign, with every change in the law. We keep rewriting America, even when the words stay the same. We reread the First Amendment in a world of TikTok. We argue the Second Amendment after each tragedy. We debate privacy in the age of smart watches and DNA kits. And still the Constitution holds. Because it is not worshipped. It is worked. It is not sacred. It is scrutinized. And it survives not because it is untouchable, but because we never stop touching it. Sometimes gently, sometimes with rage, always with belief that it matters, that it belongs to us, that it is not theirs, the founders. It is ours. It is America's spine, scarred, twisted, still upright. And tomorrow someone will open that little booklet again and wonder what they might add, what they might change, what they are willing to fight for. The Constitution survives not because it is eternal, but because each generation makes it new. A quiet ending, liberty at the door and sleep on the horizon. So now we close the final page, not with a bang, not with a verdict, but with a whisper. The Constitution was never meant to lull us. It was meant to stir us, to ask questions, to leave some unanswered, to keep us arguing at dinner tables and in courtrooms, in classrooms and on sidewalks. And maybe that is what freedom really sounds like. Not a song, not a speech, but voices rising and overlapping, discordant, persistent, alive. It is messy. It is exhausting. It is utterly American. Because this country was born, not from agreement, but from disagreement, from debate, from refusal to be ruled without say. And we still refuse, in ways that are hopeful and in ways that hurt. We refuse silence. We refuse erasure. We refuse to believe that the past cannot be rethought or the future reshaped. And all the while the Constitution waits on a shelf, quiet, weathered, patient. It has seen centuries pass, and still it listens. To you, to me, to the student in civics class, wondering why it matters, to the protester with ink still wet on their sign, to the judge reading between its lines, to the writer trying to explain it in the middle of the night. Maybe even to the person like you who made it all the way here, who stayed through every amendment, every argument, every comma. Thank you for walking that long road with me. Thank you for caring enough to wonder. Now close your eyes. Rest. Let the words hum softly in the background. You do not have to remember every clause or every case. Just remember this. The Constitution is not finished, because you are not finished, and tomorrow it will still be there, waiting, like a book half read, like a promise half kept. Good night, my friend. Sleep well, and let liberty keep watch at your door.